Hello again. Well, I've highlighted the European doom bands that formed the genre back in the early 70s. The Black Sabbaths, Lucifer Friend, great bands like that. Well, now it's time for the good old United States to have their turn. So I'm going to talk today about three bands that played doom in the early 70s, or at least played doomy, heavy, some of the heavier bands from the United States from the early 70s. Obviously, I've got this CD here, Pentagram, probably the most famous United States early doom band, the most known pioneer of doom from the United States, from Virginia. This is their First Daze Here collection, has their early 70s recordings, which were not put together or released for quite a while, and this CD is amazing. So if you don't have this, if you're a Doom fan, oh my god, you're missing out. What are you doing? Pentagram, First Daze Here, get this album, okay? But since you all know so much about Pentagram, we're going to talk about three other bands other than Pentagram. Again, not to this level, they're not this, classic, but they're pretty damn good bands. And they're a bit more underground, underrated, that you may not have heard. But Pentagram, yeah. This is obviously one of the most well-known doom recordings from the 70s, and for good reason. Obviously, you all remember tracks like When the Scream Comes, Forever My Queen. Those are very famous songs. Be Forewarned. Review Your Choices. So, let's talk about three other bands from the United States from the same time frame, early 70s, that were playing heavy proto doomish music. Enjoy the presentation, and thank you for watching. Hello, thanks for listening to my presentation today about some of the heaviest bands that were around in the early 70s from the United States. I've already talked about some of the European bands that influenced doom and very heavy stoner doom metal, but let's talk about some from the United States, because there were some very good bands from this country that I live in as well during the first years of the 70s. I'm going to talk about a few bands today. The first one I'm going to talk about is called Bang. Yes, Bang. And I'm sure many of you know this band because they are actually still around to this day releasing music. One of the few bands from that era that still releases music in 2023. When I found out that they were releasing another album in 2023, I was pretty amazed. That's a 50-year span between their earliest recordings, and that's just pretty rare. I'm actually friends with the vocalists on Facebook, and that's how I found out about the new album. Embarrassingly, I have not listened to it yet, but I will get to that as soon as possible. I want to focus on their self-titled album that was released in 1972 on Capitol Records. And I just want to talk about how crazy that is, that this band was released on Capitol Records. Now, Capitol Records, they're a big fish, owned by Universal Music Group. And so to have a band like this that was playing music that was this heavy, what would be considered underground, obscure music today, it's just amazing how much different things were back in the 70s, how much different the landscape was musically. I mean, bands that would never make it on major labels today were able to get signed to major labels. And the even more amazing fact about this band is that their self-titled debut album from 1972 actually reached number 164 on the US charts. So they Bang charted with their self-titled album. And if you listen to this album, you will be amazed. It just tells you how much has changed for the worse since the 70s. I was really born way too late, because back then you could actually make it and get signed to a major label as a band like this, playing proto heavy dooms type metal. This album is a blistering album, but let's get into where Bang was from first. I'm jumping the gun here. Bang was formed in 1969 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They were formed by the drummer Tony D'Aero and bassist Frank Ferreira, and they had the guitarist Frank Glicken. They actually scored a minor hit with Questions off of their self-titled debut album that actually reached number 90 on the Billboard Hot 100. It reached the Billboard Hot 100, one of their singles. They were strongly influenced by Sabbath and are considered one of the forerunners to doom metal. So yes, they are definitely one of the birthers of heavy metal. And boy, I am just blown away that they charted and they were on Capitol Records. That just really blows my mind. And they released several records too on Capitol, not just one. I mean, the modern examples you have like the Melvins. They got signed to a major label in the 90s. But man, Bang, I cannot believe that they were on Capitol Records releasing top, charting music. The United States music scene was awesome back then. Absolutely awesome. I mean, I guess it shouldn't be surprising when you take into consideration what music was popular in the early 70s that was on the radio and stuff like that. I mean, God, if you look at the top charts from the 70s, it's just mind-blowing how much heavy metal and some of the proto stoner and proto doom stuff is on there. So this band was around for about 4 years in the 70s. They unfortunately, despite having some charting success and being on a major label, they didn't last very long in the 70s originally, only releasing a few albums and were done by 1974. But they were able to return for another album in 1999 called Return to Zero, and then their latest one, like I said, was just released this year called Another Me. The self-titled album, that's the one I'm most familiar with. It's obviously their most famous record, about 35 minutes long with 8 tracks, one of those typical 70s albums that's really quick and to the point. I like that. It's slim, it's no filler, all killer. The opening track, Lions and Christians, is about freaking you take a like gladiator, basically like gladiator fights and stuff like that, where the Christians would feed people to the lions, and it's just a very heavy metal, doomy type of subject matter. Lions and Christians has some blistering guitar work and vocal work. Frank is a very good vocalist, and The Queen is another very blistering track, pummeling track with some searing guitar riffs and vocal work at 5.5 minutes. It's the longest track on the album. They have some more great songs, Come With Me and Future Shock, and Questions obviously being their big hit. The whole album is really good. I'm sure you've heard this album, but if you haven't, check out Bang's self-titled debut album. Definitely one of the craziest success stories, heaviest bands from their era, and I'm so happy that they're still around 50 years later making music. Alright, the second band I want to talk about today is called Bulbous Creation. They released one album called You Won't Remember Dying. Now this album was recorded around 1971 and was kind of written throughout 69 and 70, but it wasn't released until 2 decades later in 1994. So like a lot of these albums, it's uncovered decades later, luckily, by some really nice music people that decide that it's worth hearing and worth supporting. So that's always good to hear. But it makes you wonder how many of these albums, how many of these bands from back in the day that were playing great music like this, how many of them are completely forgotten, never released by people? How much of this stuff have you not heard? Man, I bet you there's so many great bands that we have not heard. Bulbous Creation was one of those bands that we very well could have missed out on, because they were from a very humble background. They were from a small town in Kansas called Prairie Springs, which is about 10 minutes outside of Kansas City. And that's actually my neck of the woods. I'm from Nebraska, and it borders the state of Kansas. It's nice to see some bands from my neck of the woods from the Midwest, and they were formed by the bassist Jim Wine and the guitarist/vocalist Paul Parkinson, and they both grew up in the same town, Prairie Village, Kansas. And the album You Won't Remember Dying is one of the earliest, doomiest type of albums in terms of having this really gloomy, doomy sound that really did influence doom. I mean, they weren't strictly doom metal by any means, but you gotta remember that this was from the early 70s, so stuff had not gotten super heavy yet, other than like Black Sabbath and Sir Lord Baltimore and stuff like that. But this band was a very dark, gloomy, slow playing, brooding type of band. The album really reminds me of Pentagram. If you remember their earliest recordings, First Daze Here, if you remember the Pentagram sound in their earliest recordings, this album really reminds me of that. And this was actually recorded before those songs from Pentagram. Not quite as doomy or heavy as Pentagram got at times, but really very similar in terms of the whole mood and just the themes. You Won't Remember Dying starts off with End of the Page, which is a very mellow track, and it has some great guitar work in it. The album really hits its stride in the middle section. That's the meat and potatoes of the album, track 3 through 5, starting with Satan, track 3, probably one of my favorites on the album. Satan is a very dark, brooding song, very doomy. Fever Machine Man, track 4 is the same way, and Let's Go to the Sea is another nice, lengthy track that really builds up and has this nice, beautiful guitar work on it. The album closes also with Stormy Monday, another really nice, slow, doomy, brooding track. They just had a lot of nice, doomy atmosphere on this album, and the vocal work is really, really pretty good as well. I really like their organ that they mix in there as well, which, I mean, what would it be, early 70s album be without organ, right? So they got some organ mixed in as well. It's pretty bluesy, as you would expect from this time frame, but it's also doomy as well. And Bulbous Creation definitely deserves to be found. They actually have this album, their lone album, is actually up on YouTube, and it's got 300,000 views, uploaded 10 years ago. 300,000 views for this little lone album from Kansas is pretty good. So it's nice to see that it's found an audience on YouTube. But unfortunately, they did not stick around very long, and unfortunately, cancer claimed the lives of both Alan Lewis in 1998, as well as their singer-songwriter Paul Parkinson in 2001. He died of leukemia. So it was a sad end to the band, but at least they had their due in the 90s when their album was finally released, and finally they began to get some much deserved attention. So they did get to enjoy a little bit of a run before the members passed away, but it's too bad that Paul Parkinson didn't live past 2001. But this album is great for Doom fans. Definitely one of the most influential. If you like Pentagram and their early stuff, you would love Bulbous Creation. So check them out. About 40 minutes long, some real nice, brooding, long stuff. And the last band I want to talk about today that influenced Doom from the United States is, of course, Coven, which I'm sure most of you know, because this band has a pretty large cult following for sure. They actually have been very successful in the underground and have reached quite a bit of people. They actually were formed in 1967, and they released a debut album which is definitely very influential. It's called Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls. Interesting is that it has a female lead singer, which is kind of uncommon for the genre. Her name was Jinx Dawson. They had Jim Dollinger on guitar. Steve Ross played drums. The album was, of course, one of the earliest that dealt with occult and satanic themes, and it was actually released around the time of the Manson family murders and all that crap. It was released in 1969, in the summer of 1969, which is right when all this was going on. So there's a lot of hysteria and fear about this kind of stuff in America, and this album was actually pulled from the market pretty soon after it was released. Very occult, dark, and especially for 1969, people were definitely freaked out by an album like this back then. Yeah, it's a pretty dark album, pretty cool album if you're into that dark occult stuff. The album marked the first appearance of stuff like the Sign of the Horns, Inverted Crosses, and Hail Satan. The phrase was used. It reminds me of Black Sabbath, and in fact, their opening track on the album is called Black Sabbath. But, the album title and the song titles are really, very good for Doom fans. Packed with Lucifer, Choke, Thirst, Die, Wicked Woman, Satanic Mass closes the album with Satanic Mass, 13-minute closing track. Crazy stuff. Really good for Doom fans, though. And actually, Kurt Cobain spoke of this album in 1990, and he said that it was one of the albums that they would listen to while driving to a show on tour. Really interesting that Kurt Cobain of Nirvana actually listened to this. Some people say that they influenced Black Sabbath, and of course they released their debut a year before Black Sabbath released their debut. A lot of people think that Black Sabbath heard this band and took inspiration from them, but Tony Iommi has denied it. He says they only heard about Coven after the release of their debut album, so it was just a coincidence. This band, Coven, was from Chicago, Illinois. Black Sabbath was obviously from England, so I could definitely see that they didn't hear it right away. Coven would release a couple more albums, one self-titled Coven album in 1971, as well as Blood on the Snow in 1974. I haven't heard either of those albums. So check out Coven's music if you haven't heard them, as well as Bulbous Creation, and of course, Bang. Thank you for listening to 3 bands that influenced doom metal from the United States in the early 70s. I hope you enjoyed some of these groups that maybe you haven't heard before. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon. Doom on.